I built an empire after my father abandoned me completely, leaving me with nothing. 15 years later, his new wife tried to secretly sell off his remaining assets, unaware she was actually selling them directly to the daughter they threw away. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Kin and Karma. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, mirroring the dull, relentless ache in my chest. I was 45 years old, the CEO of a global logistics empire, yet in that moment, I felt as fragile as spun glass. A severe bout of pneumonia, brought on by months of relentless international travel and sheer exhaustion, had confined me to my bed for the better part of 2 weeks. Every breath was a labored effort, a physical reminder of how hard I had pushed myself to build a life out of the ashes of my past. I was wrapped in heavy blankets, sipping lukewarm tea, when my phone vibrated on the nightstand. The caller ID flashed with Mason's name. Mason was 40, my most trusted corporate attorney, and occasionally, when the situation demanded it, a highly discreet private investigator. Aurora, Mason's voice came through the speaker, tight and unnaturally formal. I apologize for calling while you are on medical leave, but something has crossed my desk that you need to see immediately. I'm resting, Mason, I rasped, coughing into a tissue. Can't Jade handle it? She is my chief of staff for a reason. She knows my schedule and my limits right now. Jade is the one who flagged it for me, Mason replied gently. Aurora, it's about Levi, your father. The name hit me like a physical blow. Levi. I hadn't spoken to my father in 15 long, agonizing years. Not since the day he packed my bags, placed them on the porch, and told me I was no longer his daughter. What about him? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He's in the hospital, a severe stroke, but that isn't why I am calling. Mason paused, and I could hear the rustle of papers. Someone is quietly trying to liquidate his entire estate. The commercial properties, the family home, everything. They are routing it through a shell company to avoid immediate detection. I closed my eyes, the room spinning slightly. Who? Sylvia, Mason said, his tone darkening. And Aurora, the holding company she just approached to buy the primary real estate portfolio. It's one of our subsidiaries. She doesn't realize she's trying to sell your father's legacy directly to you. The breath caught in my throat, triggering a painful coughing fit. 15 years of silence, 15 years of wondering why I was discarded, and now this. Sylvia, the woman who had replaced my mother, was tearing apart what little my father had left while he lay defenseless in a hospital bed. The revelation washed over me, cold and unforgiving. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The immediate aftermath of Mason's phone call left me in a state of physical and emotional paralysis. My fever seemed to spike, my skin clammy as the ghosts of my past rushed back into the sterile luxury of my bedroom. I remembered the heavy oak doors of my childhood home closing in my face. I remembered the absolute coldness in Levi's eyes, a man who had once been my hero, suddenly looking at me with undisguised disgust. I had spent a decade and a half trying to prove to a ghost that I was worthy, building my company from a single leased delivery truck into a global titan. I needed to hear her voice. I needed to know if it was true. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number I hadn't called in a decade and a half, my father's personal cell phone. It rang 4 times before the line clicked open. Levi's phone, a voice answered. It was smooth, practiced, and dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. It was Sylvia. Sylvia, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rattling in my lungs. It's Aurora. I heard about my father. I heard he is in the hospital. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a long, freezing silence. When she finally spoke, the sweetness had vanished, replaced by a venomous hiss. How did you get this number? Why are you calling here? He is my father, Sylvia. I have a right to know what condition he is in. Which hospital is he at? You have no rights, Sylvia snapped, her voice rising in pitch. He made his feelings about you perfectly clear 15 years ago, Aurora. You broke his heart. You ruined this family. He is resting, and the absolute last thing he needs is the stress of seeing your face. Do not come here. Do not call again. If you show up, I will have security remove you. Sylvia, please, just tell me if he is going to. The line went dead. She had hung up on me. I sat in the silence of my room, staring at the darkened screen of my phone. The rejection was as sharp and agonizing as it had been when I was 27. She was guarding him, isolating him, just as she always had. She thought she was in complete control, pulling the strings while she dismantled his life for her own gain. She thought I was still that helpless, discarded daughter standing on the porch in the rain. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. The irony was bitter and sharp. Before Sylvia had entered our lives, I had been Levi's entire world. After my mother passed away, I sacrificed everything for him. I gave up my acceptance to a prestigious university, choosing instead to stay home and help him run his regional hardware distribution center. I worked 60-hour weeks, managing the inventory, handling the difficult clients, and ensuring his dream stayed afloat. I was his right hand, his confidant, his loyal soldier. I never asked for a salary increase. I never asked for a vacation. His success was my success. Then Sylvia arrived. She was 60 now, but even back then, she possessed a predatory elegance. She introduced herself as an independent lifestyle and wellness consultant, a remarkably vague profession that seemed to involve nothing more than attending charity galas and spending other people's money. From the moment she stepped into our home, her perfectly manicured nails began picking at the seams of my relationship with my father. She was polished, always dressed in designer labels that stood in stark contrast to our working-class roots. I remembered how she would subtly mock my work boots, how she would whisper in Levi's ear during dinner, her eyes darting toward me with a disguised sneer. Most alarming was her sudden, intense interest in the company's financial ledgers. She would ask seemingly innocent questions about profit margins, about property deeds, about my father's retirement accounts. I had tried to warn him. I had begged him to see that she was isolating him from his old friends, that she was slowly taking over his accounts. But Sylvia was a master of the long con. She played the victim perfectly, weeping to Levi that I was jealous and cruel to her. And then, the final blow came. A massive sum of money disappeared from the company accounts, and a forged paper trail pointed directly to me. Before I could even hire a lawyer to defend myself, Levi threw me out. Now, sitting in my bed, looking at the encrypted files Mason had just forwarded to my tablet, the full scope of her deceit was laid bare. Jade had meticulously organized the documents. Sylvia wasn't just selling the properties. She had been siphoning funds into an offshore account for the last 3 years. She was systematically bleeding my father dry, and now that his health was failing, she was attempting a final, massive cash-out before he passed away. She was a parasite, and she was about to feast on the last remains of my family. I closed the files and took a deep, shuddering breath, the pneumonia momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold, searing anger. I did not stay in bed. The moment the line went dead, a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp as cracked ice, flooded my system, entirely overriding the fever that had been burning through me for days. I pushed the heavy, down-filled comforter aside, the aggressively chilled air of my penthouse immediately biting at my overheated skin. My legs felt like lead, trembling violently as my bare feet finally made contact with the imported mahogany floorboards. Every single joint in my body ached, offering a stiff protest against the sudden, forced movement, but I ignored the pain. I had spent 15 years building an armor of absolute resilience, and I was not about to let a mere physical illness stop me now. I walked, slowly and deliberately, to the massive glass desk situated in the corner of my master suite. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my pale, drawn face in the dimly lit room. I didn't just want to see the summary Mason had provided. I wanted to see the raw data. I wanted to see the exact mechanism by which Sylvia was attempting to dismantle my father's life's work. 10 minutes later, the private elevator that opened directly into my foyer chimed. I heard the muffled, professional footsteps of Jade, my chief of staff, followed closely by the heavier, measured tread of Mason. They found me sitting at the dining table, wrapped in a thick cashmere robe, a steaming mug of black tea clutched tightly in my hands to stop their shaking. Jade, a brilliant 32-year-old woman with an unparalleled talent for corporate intelligence, immediately began unpacking a thick, leather-bound briefcase. She laid out 4 distinct stacks of manila folders across the polished stone surface of the table. Mason, lookin'. G, deeply concerned by my pallor, took a seat opposite me, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Aurora, you should be resting," Mason began, his voice laced with genuine worry. "The doctors were very explicit about your recovery parameters." "The doctors do not know that the woman who destroyed my family is currently trying to liquidate it," I replied, my voice raspy but entirely devoid of hesitation. "Walk me through the exact structure of this proposed sale, Mason. Do not leave out a single detail, no matter how insignificant you think it might be." Mason sighed, recognizing the immovable tone in my voice. He reached forward and tapped the thickest stack of folders. "Sylvia is utilizing a highly aggressive, deeply obfuscated strategy. She has engaged a boutique, morally flexible brokerage firm out of the city to list Levi's entire commercial property portfolio. We are talking about the 3 regional distribution warehouses, the downtown office building, and the 2 tracts of undeveloped industrial land. She is pricing them at roughly 30% below fair market value." "A fire sale?" Jade interjected, her eyes scanning a spreadsheet she had just pulled up on her tablet. "She wants the cash immediately, and she is willing to take a massive loss on the total value of the assets to ensure the transaction closes before anyone asks too many questions. Specifically, before your father recovers enough cognitive function to audit his own holdings." "And the buyer?" I asked, leaning forward, the steam from my tea curling around my face. "That is where her absolute ignorance of the corporate landscape becomes her greatest liability," Mason said, a rare, grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "She instructed her broker to find a private equity firm that could close in all cash within 14 days. Her broker reached out to a holding company called Sentinel Capital Investments. They signed a letter of intent yesterday afternoon." I stared at him, the pieces rapidly locking together in my mind. "Sentinel Capital," I whispered, the name rolling off my tongue. "Exactly," Mason nodded firmly. "Sentinel Capital is a Tier 3 subsidiary of your own logistics empire, Aurora. You acquired it 3 years ago to manage your surplus real estate acquisitions. Sylvia is trying to quietly sell your father's legacy, and the faceless corporate entity she chose to sell it to is, ultimately, you control the purse strings of this entire transaction." A profound, echoing silence filled the dining room. The sheer, unfathomable irony of the situation settled heavily over me. For 15 years, Sylvia had convinced my father that I was a thief, a failure, a stain on his reputation. Now, she was inadvertently bringing his entire kingdom directly to my doorstep, begging me to buy it. "This is our leverage," I said, my voice steadying, the weakness of the pneumonia evaporating under the heat of my rising determination. "She thinks she is dealing with a faceless board of directors who only care about a discount. We are going to use that. Mason, I want Sentinel Capital to proceed with the acquisition. Send over the preliminary paperwork to her broker. Make it look entirely standard." "You want to buy the properties?" Jade asked, raising an eyebrow in surprise. "No," I corrected, looking directly into Jade's eyes. "I want to trap her in the due diligence phase. Mason, draft a response to her letter of intent. State that Sentinel Capital is highly interested, but given the accelerated timeline and the discounted price, our corporate policy mandates an immediate, comprehensive, in-person audit of the physical properties and a full review of the estate's financial history for the last 10 years. We will stipulate that a senior executive from Sentinel must tour the primary warehouse facility with the seller's representative. You want to force her into a meeting, Mason said, catching my drift. She will have to attend to push the sale through. Exactly, I said. And Jade, I need you to shift your entire focus. I do not care about the properties right now. I care about Sylvia. I want a complete, microscopic forensic deep dive into her life before she met my father. She claimed to be a wellness consultant. I want to know where she lived, who she associated with, and every single financial footprint she left behind before she walked into our hardware store 15 years ago. If she is capable of orchestrating this level of fraud now, she has done it before. Consider it done, Jade said, her fingers already flying across the screen of her tablet. I will pull every public record, tax filing, and civil court document I can find in all 50 states. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a brief moment. The battle lines were drawn. The passive, broken daughter she remembered was dead. I was an active strategist now, and I was holding all the cards. 72 hours later, my fever had broken, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I stood in the cavernous, echoing expanse of my father's primary distribution warehouse. The air smelled of cardboard, machine oil, and dust, a scent so profoundly tied to my childhood that it made my heart ache. I wore a tailored, charcoal gray pantsuit, my posture perfectly rigid, my expression an impenetrable mask. Mason stood silently to my left, holding a sleek leather portfolio. We were waiting in what used to be the foreman's office, a glass-walled room overlooking the main floor. Sylvia was exactly 14 minutes late. It was a classic power play, an attempt to make the faceless corporate buyers wait on her terms. Finally, the heavy metal door at the far end of the warehouse ground open. Sylvia walked in, accompanied by a slick, overly cologned man who could only be her real estate broker. She was dressed entirely inappropriately for an industrial site visit, wearing a cream-colored silk blouse, designer slacks, and stiletto heels that clicked sharply against the concrete floor. She looked around the warehouse with an expression of barely concealed disgust, clearly anxious to be rid of the place. I watched through the glass as the broker gestured toward the foreman's office. Sylvia nodded, her chin raised in a posture of assumed superiority, and began walking up the metal stairs. She opened the door, a practiced, charming smile already plastered across her face. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the slight delay. The traffic from the hospital was simply..." Her voice abruptly died in her throat. The charming smile fractured, slipping off her face to reveal a mask of absolute, paralyzing shock. She stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured hand still gripping the door handle. Her eyes darted from Mason, whose face gave away nothing to me, standing behind the heavy metal desk. "Hello, Sylvia," I said. My voice was calm, resonant, and entirely lacking the desperation she had heard on the phone 3 days prior. "Thank you for making the time to accommodate our corporate audit." The broker, oblivious to the sudden, suffocating tension in the room, stepped forward enthusiastically. "Ah, you must be the senior executives from Sentinel Capital. I'm Richard, representing the seller, Mrs. Vance. It is a pleasure to meet you." He extended a hand. I ignored it, keeping my eyes locked entirely on Sylvia. What is this?" Sylvia stammered, the color draining rapidly from her face, leaving her looking suddenly her age. "What are you doing here, Aurora? This is a private, confidential business meeting. You are trespassing on your father's property. I will call the police this instant." She reached nervously into her designer handbag, her hands shaking so badly she dropped her keys onto the floor. "I wouldn't do that, Sylvia," I said softly, taking a single step around the desk. "Because you are absolutely right. This is a private business meeting. A meeting that you agreed to, in writing, when you signed the letter of intent with Sentinel Capital." Sylvia froze, her hand hovering over her bag. Her mind desperately tried to process the information. "Sentinel Capital? No, that is a private equity firm based in Chicago. My broker verified them. They are a multi-million-dollar holding company." "They are," Mason interjected smoothly, opening his portfolio and withdrawing a single, heavily stamped legal document. And Sentinel Capital is a wholly owned subsidiary of Vance Global Logistics, the founder, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer of which is standing right in front of you. I watched the realization hit her. It was a physical impact. She staggered backward half a step, her breath catching in her throat. The smug, controlling woman who had tormented my youth was suddenly replaced by a cornered animal. "This is a joke," Sylvia hissed, her voice trembling with rising panic. "This is some sick, twisted joke. You are trying to steal from your father again. You couldn't get it right 15 years ago, so you are trying to trick me now. Richard, we are leaving. We will find another buyer. Deal with someone reputable." She turned to flee, grabbing the confused broker by the arm. "You aren't going anywhere, and you aren't finding another buyer," I stated, my voice slicing through the air like a blade, stopping her in the doorway. "Mason, clarify her legal standing." "By signing the letter of intent and accepting the preliminary escrow deposit from Sentinel Capital," Mason recited, his tone rigidly professional. "You agreed to a strict 60-day exclusivity period, Mrs. Vance. If you attempt to list these properties with another buyer, or if you attempt to back out of the sale without satisfying our audit requirements, Sentinel Capital will instantly file a lease pendens against every single property in this portfolio, effectively freezing them in litigation for years. You cannot sell them to anyone else." Sylvia spun back around to face me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fury. "You planned this. You hacked into my files. This is harassment. I will tell Levi. I will tell him exactly what you are doing to his legacy." "Please do," I replied, taking another step forward until I was only a few feet away from her. "Tell him that the daughter he threw away is the only person capable of buying his company. Tell him that you tried to sell his life's work for pennies on the dollar to fuel your own greed. And while you are at it, tell him why you insisted on a cash-only transaction routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands." Sylvia's jaw dropped. The poorly executed threats died on her lips. She realized in that terrifying instant that I didn't just know about the sale, I knew about the theft. You have no proof of anything," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You are just a bitter, jealous child." "I am the buyer," I countered, my voice unwavering. "I hold the capital, and I require a full, forensic audit of the last 10 years of the estate's finances, including your personal accounts, before I release a single dime into escrow. You are trapped, Sylvia, and I am just getting started." The warehouse confrontation sent Sylvia into an absolute tailspin of desperation. Over the next 48 hours, Mason's office received a barrage of frantic, poorly constructed legal threats from Sylvia's rapidly hired, low-tier attorneys. They threatened injunctions, claimed harassment, and wildly accused Sentinel Capital of predatory practices. Mason swatted them away with effortless, citing the ironclad exclusivity clause she had willingly signed. She was desperately trying to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped entirely out of her grasp. Meanwhile, back in the secure, quiet confines of my office, Jade was delivering the final, devastating blow to Sylvia's carefully constructed facade. Jade laid a thick, blue-bound dossier on my desk, her expression grim but profoundly satisfied. "You were right to trust your instincts, Aurora. Sylvia Vance is a completely fabricated identity." I opened the dossier, staring at a photocopy of an old, faded marriage certificate. "Explain." "Her maiden name is Sylvia Trent," Jade began, pointing to the document. "Before she moved to our state and suddenly developed an interest in your father's hardware business, she lived in Arizona. She was married to a man named Arthur Pendleton. He was 20 years her senior, owned a highly lucrative chain of dry-cleaning businesses, and had recently suffered a mild heart attack." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The pattern was horrifyingly identical. What happened to Arthur? 10 years before she met your father, Arthur Pendleton's businesses mysteriously went bankrupt, Jade continued, turning the pages to reveal court transcripts and bank records. Massive sums of cash were withdrawn and unaccounted for. His children accused Sylvia of elder abuse and fraud, claiming she had isolated him and forged his signature on power of attorney documents. Unfortunately, Arthur passed away before the civil trial could conclude. Without his testimony, the children ran out of legal funds to fight her. Sylvia walked away with the remains of his estate, changed her last name back to her mother's maiden name, moved states, and targeted your father. I traced the harsh, typed letters of the Arizona court documents. This wasn't just a greedy stepmother. This was a professional, systematic predator. She had honed her craft on another family, perfecting the art of isolation and financial drain before she ever set foot in my home. And she had used the exact same playbook to frame me, removing the only obstacle between her and Levi's wealth. "This is it," I said, my voice barely a whisper, thick with a profound, delayed grief for the 15 years I had lost. "This is the proof. She isn't just selling the properties, Jade. She's executing her final exit strategy. If my father dies, she disappears with everything, just like she did in Arizona." "What is our next move?" Jade asked quietly. "We go to the hospital," I said, standing up, a fierce, protective instinct finally breaking through the years of hurt. "We break the spell." The private recovery wing of the hospital was quiet, the air smelling of antiseptic and floral arrangements. Mason and I bypassed the front desk entirely, my status and quiet authority easily moving us past the nurse's station. We reached Levi's room just as the door opened. Sylvia stepped out, holding a plastic cup of water. When she saw me standing in the hallway, the color instantly drained from her face. She dropped the cup, water splashing across the polished linoleum. "Security," she screamed, her voice echoing wildly down the quiet corridor. "Get her away from here. She is not allowed here." "Keep your voice down, Sylvia," I ordered, stepping past her and pushing the heavy wooden door open. My father was lying in the hospital bed. He looked incredibly frail, his skin gray, his right side slightly drooping from the effects of the stroke. The machines beeped a slow, steady rhythm. When his eyes found me, they widened in shock, confusion, and a flicker of the old anger that had banished me. "Aurora," he slurred slightly, trying to push himself up on his good elbow. "What? What are you doing here? Get out." "Levi, don't listen to her," Sylvia cried, rushing into the room and positioning herself defensively between the bed and me. "She is trying to stress you. She is trying to ruin us again. I told you, she is harassing me over the business." "I am not here to stress you, Dad," I said, using the word I hadn't spoken aloud in a decade and a half. It felt foreign, heavy on my tongue. "I am here to save your life, because the woman standing next to you has been slowly destroying it for 15 years. "Lies," Sylvia shrieked, tears of sheer panic welling in her eyes. "Levi, she is a thief. You know what she did." "I know what you did, Sylvia," I corrected, my voice booming through the small room, commanding absolute authority. I held up the blue dossier. "Or should I call you Sylvia Trent, the widow of Arthur Pendleton?" Sylvia gasped, stumbling backward against the edge of the bed, as if she had been physically struck. Levi's brow furrowed, his confusion deepening. Who is Arthur?" he managed to ask, looking from me to his wife. "Arthur Pendleton was her previous husband in Arizona," I said, stepping closer to the bed, ignoring Sylvia entirely. "A man 20 years her senior, whose businesses went bankrupt right before he conveniently passed away, leaving his children with nothing and Sylvia with a padded bank account. I have the court transcripts, Dad. I have the testimonies from his children. She isolates older, wealthy men, drains their accounts, frames anyone who gets in the way, and disappears." "Levi, she forged those," Sylvia wept, grabbing his hand desperately. "She has always hated me. She is making this up to get your money." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice again. I simply opened the dossier to the bank records Mason had pulled from Sentinel Capital's audit. "Look at this, Dad," I said gently, laying the paper on his lap over the blanket. "These are the transaction records from your business accounts for the last 3 years. She has been wiring $30,000 a month to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation. And right now, while you are lying in this bed, she is actively trying to sell your distribution warehouses and your office building at a massive loss just to get cash in hand before you realize what she has done." Levi weakly lifted his good hand, his trembling fingers tracing the highlighted rows of massive, unauthorized withdrawals. The undeniable proof was right in front of him. The numbers didn't lie. The signatures, forged to look like his, didn't lie. He looked up at Sylvia. The absolute, blind devotion that had blinded him for 15 years began to fracture. His breathing grew shallow, his eyes searching her panicked, guilty face. "Sylvia," he whispered, his voice cracking with a heartbreaking vulnerability. Is this true, the money?" "Levi, I was protecting our assets," she stammered, her lies colliding into one another, creating a chaotic mess of excuses. "The market is bad, I had to secure our future, she is twisting the truth." Levi looked back down at the paper, then slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't see the anger that had exiled me. I saw profound, devastating realization. The spell was breaking. The foundation of lies upon which she had built her comfortable life was crumbling beneath her feet in real time. "Get my lawyer," Levi managed to choke out, his voice weak but his intention suddenly, fiercely clear. He pulled his hand away from Sylvia's grasp as if her skin burned him. Not hers, get mine." Sylvia let out a strangled cry of defeat, her carefully constructed world finally collapsing in on itself, but I knew she wasn't done. Cornered animals always fight the hardest right before the end. 4 agonizingly long weeks passed following the confrontation in the hospital room. During that time, my father's physical recovery was slow, but his mental clarity returned with a sharp, undeniable vengeance. The spell had truly been broken, and in its place, a quiet, terrifying resolve had settled over him. Under Mason's strict, highly classified guidance, Levi had quietly revoked Sylvia's medical and financial power of attorney from his hospital bed, replacing her entirely with me. Sylvia, blissfully unaware of the legal avalanche suspended directly above her head, believed she was still negotiating a lucrative divorce settlement. She thought she had salvaged a piece of the pie. She was wrong. The climax of 15 years of deception did not take place in a scream. Match in a hallway, but in the freezing, sterile environment of Mason's primary conference room on the 40th floor of his downtown law firm. The massive mahogany table stretched the length of the room, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the overcast city skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat near the head of the table, wearing a stark white, tailored blazer that felt like modern armor. Jade sat to my right, her laptop open, seamlessly connected to the large presentation monitor mounted on the far wall. Mason sat to my left, a mountain of meticulously tabbed binders stacked neatly in front of him. At the very head of the table sat Levi. He was in a specialized wheelchair, his posture slightly slumped from the lingering weakness of the stroke, but his eyes were bright, focused, and burning with an intensity I had not seen since I was a young woman working in his hardware store. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. Sylvia walked in, flanked by a remarkably cheap, sweaty-looking attorney she had clearly hired off a daytime television advertisement. She was dressed in a morning black designer dress, projecting the image of the aggrieved, long-suffering wife. However, the moment her eyes landed on the sheer number of people in the room, and specifically on the undeniable presence of my father sitting at the head of the table, her confident stride faltered. "What is this?" Sylvia demanded, her voice tight and defensive as she gripped the back of a leather chair opposite us. "Mr. Thorne, my attorney and I were told this was a preliminary mediation regarding the dissolution of my marriage to Levi. We were not informed that outside parties would be present." "I am not an outside party, Sylvia," I said, my voice echoing calmly in the large room. "I am the newly appointed sole executor of the Vance estate, the primary beneficiary of the newly restructured living trust, and the CEO of the company you attempted to defraud. Please take a seat. We have a considerable amount of ground to cover. Sylvia's attorney, a man whose name tag read Mr. Higgins, nervously wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Now, see here. My client is entitled to 50% of all marital assets accumulated during the 15 years of their union. We are prepared to file. You are prepared to file absolutely nothing, Mr. Higgins, Mason interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a heavy steel blade. He slid the first, incredibly thick binder across the polished wood. It stopped mere inches from Sylvia's trembling hands. Because your client has no marital assets. Your client has systematically embezzled, defrauded, and hidden assets for over a decade. This meeting is not a negotiation. It is a notification of terms. This is outrageous, Sylvia shrieked, slamming her hands down on the table, the veneer of the elegant wife shattering instantly. Levi, are you going to let them speak to me this way? After everything I have done for you, after I cared for you. Levi did not blink. He did not flinch. He simply looked at her as if she were a stranger who had wandered into his home. Show her, Aurora, he rasped, his voice rough but commanding. Show her exactly what she has done. I nodded to Jade. With a single click of her mouse, the large monitor on the wall flared to life. The screen displayed a complex, highly detailed web of financial transactions. Over the last 36 months, I began, standing up and pacing slowly behind my chair, my eyes locked onto Sylvia's rapidly paling face. You have utilized a forged power of attorney to authorize 112 separate wire transfers from my father's primary business operating accounts. These funds were routed through 3 different domestic shell companies before finally landing in an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The total sum stolen is precisely $2.4 million. Jade clicked again. The screen shifted to display the forged signature cards side by side with my father's actual, verified signature. The discrepancies, when magnified on a 60-inch screen, were glaringly obvious. I was investing it, Sylvia stammered, her eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. The market was volatile. I was trying to protect our retirement. You were preparing to run, I corrected her coldly. Just like you ran from Arizona 10 years before you met my father. Jade clicked a third time. The screen filled with the tragic face of Arthur Pendleton, along with the crest of the Arizona state court system. Mr. Higgins, Sylvia's lawyer, physically recoiled, leaning away from his own client as he read the summarized charges of elder abuse and systemic fraud displayed on the screen. I have spent the last 4 weeks utilizing the full, unlimited resources of Vance Global Logistics Corporate Intelligence Division, ICONT. Inewed, my voice rising, filling every corner of the room with the undeniable truth. We have contacted Arthur Pendleton's children. We have funded the reopening of their civil case against you. We have provided them with the exact routing numbers of your offshore accounts, proving a distinct, undeniable pattern of criminal behavior spanning 2 decades. Stop it, Sylvia screamed, tears of pure, unadulterated panic streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. She turned to Levi, falling to her knees on the expensive carpet, clutching at the armrest of his wheelchair. Levi, please, she is framing me just like she stole from the business 15 years ago. You know she is a liar. Please, you loved me. You promised to take care of me. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was completely silent, save for the pathetic sounds of Sylvia's sobbing. I watched my father look down at the woman who had poisoned his mind against his own flesh and blood. I waited for the hesitation, for the lingering remnants of the manipulation to show. Instead, Levi slowly reached out with his good hand. He did not touch her face. He grabbed the fabric of her expensive designer sleeve and forcibly removed her hand from his wheelchair, dropping her arm in disgust. You took my daughter from me, Levi said. His voice was not a shout, but a low, dangerous growl that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. The absolute certainty in his tone was devastating. You made me believe my own flesh and blood was a thief. You made me throw her out into the rain. I lost 15 years of her life because I was a fool and because you are a monster. He turned his gaze to Mason, his jaw set. "Mason, give me the pen." Mason quickly uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and placed it in Levi's waiting hand, sliding a crisp, newly minted legal document in front of him. "This is my final, irrevocable living trust," Levi announced, his voice echoing in the silent room as he pressed the pen to the paper. "It explicitly disinherits Sylvia Trent from any and all assets, properties, and liquid capital. Furthermore, I am officially authorizing Mason Thorne to hand over this entire mountain of evidence to the district attorney's office to pursue felony charges for wire fraud, elder abuse, and grand larceny." Levi signed his name with a heavy, forceful stroke. He dropped the pen onto the table with a loud clatter. The sound was final. It was the sound of a heavy oak door closing forever. "It's over, Sylvia," Levi said, leaning back in his chair, completely exhausted but profoundly victorious. "You are leaving here with nothing but the clothes on your back, and if you ever try to contact me or my daughter again, you will spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal prison." Sylvia remained on the floor, her mouth opening and closing silently. The pristine, manipulative predator had been utterly dismantled. Mr. Higgins, recognizing a sinking ship of epic proportions, hurriedly packed his briefcase. "Mrs. Vance," Higgins said nervously, refusing to look at her, "I strongly advise you to retain criminal defense counsel immediately. I do not handle felony fraud cases. Good day." He practically sprinted out of the conference room, leaving her entirely alone on the floor, surrounded by the irrefutable evidence of her own destruction. The immediate aftermath of the conference room showdown was handled with the cold, brutal efficiency I had perfected in the corporate world. Mason had not made idle threats. Within 24 hours, based on the overwhelming, thoroughly documented evidence Jade had compiled, local authorities froze Sylvia's domestic accounts, and international authorities placed a hold on her offshore funds pending a massive fraud investigation. She was forcibly evicted from the family home by court order, escorted off the premises by local sheriffs while she screamed obscenities into the wind. Her downfall was total, complete, and entirely of her own making. She faced absolute financial ruin and the very real, impending prospect of decades behind bars. But the true resolution of my story did not happen in a courtroom or a police precinct. It happened 3 weeks later, on the wide, wraparound porch of my childhood home. I had moved Levi back into the house once it was thoroughly cleaned and purged of any trace of Sylvia's existence. I hired a team of round-the-clock private nurses to ensure his physical recovery continued without interruption. I stood leaning against the wooden railing, holding a mug of coffee, watching the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawn. The air smelled of blooming jasmine and damp earth. It was peaceful. The chaotic noise of the last 2 months had finally faded into a tranquil silence. The soft hum of a motorized wheelchair approached from behind. I turned to see my father navigating his way onto the porch. He looked remarkably better. The gray pallor had left his skin, and he held himself with a renewed sense of quiet dignity. I pulled up a wicker chair and sat down next to him, the two of us looking out over the property that had been the silent witness to so much of our family's history. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We simply existed in the shared space, allowing the healing to begin in the quiet moments. "I drove past the old distribution warehouse today," I said softly, breaking the silence. "The one you started with, it needs a new roof, and the loading docks are entirely outdated." Levi let out a small, dry chuckle. "It needed a new roof 10 years ago. I stopped paying attention. I stopped caring about the things that actually mattered." He turned his head slowly to look at me. The sunlight caught the deep, weathered lines around his eyes that were filled with an oceanic depth of sorrow and regret. "Aurora," he began, his voice trembling slightly, thick with emotion. "I don't know how to bridge a 15-year gap. I don't know how to apologize for looking at my brilliant, beautiful daughter and believing the worst of her. I was weak. I was lonely after your mother died, and I let a predator convince me that my only child was my enemy. Every single day you were gone, there was a hole in my chest that nothing could fill. Tears, hot and unbidden, finally spilled over my eyelashes, tracking slowly down my cheeks. The impenetrable armor I had worn for a decade and a half, the armor that had built an empire, finally cracked, allowing the wounded 27-year-old girl inside to breathe. "It rained the day you told me to leave," I whispered, the memory suddenly vivid and overwhelming. I stood on the sidewalk with my suitcase, and I just couldn't understand. I had given you everything. I had worked so hard to make you proud. Levi reached out, his hand shaking, and gently wiped the tear from my cheek. "You have always made me proud, Aurora, even when I was too blind to see it. Look at what you built. Look at the woman you became. You didn't just survive, you conquered the world. And you did it all on your own." "Not on my own," I replied, covering his hand with mine, holding it tightly. "I had Jade. I had Mason. I built my own family when I lost this one. But I never stopped missing you, Dad. I never stopped wanting to come home." "You are home," Levi said firmly, tears now freely falling from his own eyes. "And I swear to you, for whatever time I have left on this earth, I will spend every waking moment trying to make it up to you. The business, the houses, everything, it's all yours. It always should have been." I smiled, a genuine, profound smile that reached all the way to my soul. We spent the rest of the evening on that porch, talking until the stars came out. We didn't talk about Sylvia or the stolen money. We talked about my mother, about the early days of the hardware store, about the global logistics network I had built from the ground up. We began the slow, beautiful process of weaving our lives back together. In the weeks that followed, I utilized my corporate network to seamlessly fold Levi's remaining assets under the massive umbrella of Vance Global Logistics. The properties were renovated, the old businesses modernized, and the legacy he had built was completely secured for the future. Justice had been served, not just in the legal sense, but in the deepest, most personal way imaginable. The empire I had built in my exile had become the very fortress that saved my family. The ghosts of the past had finally been put to rest, and as I looked toward the future, I knew that the foundation I stood upon now was unbreakable, forged in the fires of betrayal, and solidified by the absolute, triumphant power of the truth.